22. Achilles had let old Dyson go without hesitation, aware that his friend was under incredible pressure. The startling arrival of so many people from Partha was enough to even disturb the archer. He was so astounded by their dedication, even to someone whom Achilles himself would have trusted with his life. His thoughts were interrupted by Serpentina, who suddenly gasped and turned in the direction that he had last seen old Dyson go. Barely had she done so when he too sensed that there was something terribly wrong going on. Something involving old Dyson and Mendelin. "Stay here," he shouted at her, racing past startled townsfolk. The archer unlooped his bow. He knew that the jungle presented an even thicker environment than his native forest, but all he asked for was one clean shot. That's all he needed, providing, of course, that he was already not too late.
I wanted to do this in quiet, in private, so that others with a possible interest in the Nephilim would not take notice.
Luciano remarked to his helpless captive.
There are so many others who would be interested, yes. And besides, anything my dear sister takes an interest in is deserving of such caution.
His eyes were no longer human, and reminded old Dyson too much of Lilith's. They appraised the farmer again and again, seeking that which old Dyson himself was not there.
She is cunning, and her mind is like a labyrinth. I wasn't too sad when I learned, centuries later, that an angel had cast her out into the endless void, never to return.
He laughed.
Well, never is a relative term with her, and Arya should have known better. He should have slain her, but his kind, always too sentimental.
A sudden crackle of blue energy engulfed old Dyson. He let out a cry, but the sound was smothered. If this told Lucian anything, he did not reveal it. Instead, the demon nodded to himself and said,
There remains only the question of your brother, and what has a hold over him. I lied about so many things, but not that. Something of demonic nature does have a sway over him, and yet it's also something else. Perhaps I'll make a study of both of you. Would you like that?
"Damn you!"
Thank you. I already am. Shall we go?
Lucian smiled wider, and the world around old Dyson took on a hazy, insubstantial appearance. Somewhere in the background, the faint images of the interior of some great structure, the main temple, old Dyson assumed with a shock, began to form. And at that moment, the scene illuminated by the energy surrounding old Dyson. A feathered bolt struck the Primus directly in the throat. Lucian's head swung back from the force. Blood spilled from the ugly wound. The head of the arrow lay embedded so deep it was a wonder to old Dyson that it could not come out the back. "Old Dyson!" called Achilles. "Try to free yourself!" He had been attempting just that since his capture, only to fail miserably each time. Old Dyson had used Mendelin's Viskin, but to no avail. He began to wonder if it had been merely by chance, and whatever power his brother had wielded, that he had escaped then. As ever, Lila's mocking words returned. He was nothing. Nothing. A whistling sound persuaded another arrow soaring at Lucian. Knowing Achilles' skill, old Dyson had no doubt that it hit exactly where the archer intended. But at the last second, Lucian's hand caught the bolt just an inch from his chest. He easily snapped it in two, and as the pieces fell, reached up to take the one buried in his throat. The Primus pulled at the arrow. With the horrific sucking sound, it came free. He inhaled, and the blood dripping from his wound receded into the gap, which then healed shut. From somewhere to old Dyson's left, Achilleos let out a curse, then growled, "Not again!" Lucian eyed the blood still on the tip of the arrow. His tongue shot out and lapped up the red liquid, leaving the arrow perfectly clean. The demon chuckled as he tossed the shaft to the side.
Able to make perfect strike at night, even from a bow enchanted to miss. A fine mortal you would make,
he said.
Would you like to join us?
The Primus gestured. Achilleos grunted. Aldiason heard the shuffling of feet and guessed that the hunter was being forced forward.
I've not had this much activity in centuries,
the captor mocked.
I'd forgotten how delicious it was doing it myself.
Without a warning, a different missile came at him. However, where Achilleos' arrow had struck true, this one, a rock, bounced away after hitting what seemed an invisible shield around Lucian. That, though, did not stop a storm of more unidentifiable objects. Many were tossed with terrible aim, but several others would have hit their target if not for the same force that repelled the first rock. And from all thought the jungle completely surrounding the trio, the people of Partha, led by Cyrus's daughter, emerged. "Let him go!" shouted Saranthina. "Let them both go!" Others took up the shout, Romos among their leaders. The townsfolk brandished crude spears, axes, and pitchforks, the weapons of the common folk. Several more objects flew at the Primus with the same lack of result. For the first time, something other than arrogance filled the demon's visage. He surveyed this throng with tremendous interest.
Impressive!
Lucian boomed.
I didn't sense their coming until just before the first stone cast.
He eyed Odiason again.
Could it be you? Or maybe your brother?
The gaze narrowed.
No, I think it has something to do with you, pawn of my sister. I sense a connection spreading between all these others, but originating, yes, that would make sense. It would have to be because of...
Lucian trailed off in thought. Apparently taking this for hesitation, Ramos let out a yell and led several of his followers forward. Lucian stared at his oncoming attackers with amusement. The ground around him erupted. People, trees, dirt, nothing escaped. An explosion ripped apart the jungle 4 yards apart. Screams filled the air, and the night was momentarily blindingly bright. Old Dyson did not fear for his own life, for only would he have rather died at that moment, but the demon kept him protected. Only he was the only one, though, and his heart wailed at the thought of what was happening to all those who had come here because of him. It seemed to never end, and yet Lucian's spell in truth lasted but the blink of an eye. When it was done, there stood not a tree within 20 paces of the ground. Not only crackled black, but underneath there was a fiery glow, as if the demon had, in the process, summoned up the anger of the world. The jungle had always been hot and humid, but now the very air burned.
A taste of what is to come,
Lucian stated to no one in particular.
When this world is made over in our image.
Moans arose. Old Dyson smelled something horrible. Something that he had not smelled since his family's death. Yet these were not plague victims being incinerated to protect the living. These were innocent folk who had perished for no good reason, but they had believed old Dyson naive promises. Something within him wrenched tight. An overwhelming tangle of emotions swept through old Dyson. He relieved every mistake, every catastrophe, with an anguished cry. Old Dyson struggled to free himself, struggled, and failed again. I see you're as anxious to return to the temple as I am, jested Lucia, the towering figure surveying the carnage he had caused. The fiery cracks in the ground illuminated his face with ghastly perfection. And since there really is nothing of value left here, we might as well go now, don't you think? But even as he spoke, another shaft struck him in the chest. However, unlike the first, this one bounced off with no visible effect. Out of the corner of his eye, old Dyson saw Chilios, quickly notching another arrow. The blond archer kept his gaze on the demon as he worked. Lucian tisked.
I said that you would make a splendid Morla, but to do that you must die.
Achilles fired,
And so you shall.
continued his target. The arrow curved around in mid-flight. Achilles stumbled back, one arm going up in defense. The bolt caught him through the throat, exactly where the demon had been hit. But where Lucian was a demon, Achilles was only a mortal. A scream echoed through the ruined jungle. However, it came from not the hunter, but rather Saranthina. As Achilles crumbled into a limp heap, Cyrus's daughter ran up to him. She caught him just before he would have struck his head on an overturned tree. Oh, Achilles! No! No! The man in her arms had no words for her, and his gaze was empty. He had died instantly, although not due to any kindness on Lucian's part. The Primus now extended a hand towards Saranthina.
How delicious. Come to me, my dear. Let me comfort you in your loss.
She struggled to maintain hold of Achilles as she was pulled forward by the demon's sorcery. Lucian's power dragged her across steaming, molten gaps and ragged patches of burnt ground. Saranthina was finally unable to maintain her grip on the limp body of the hunter. All was left behind. It was all coming to an end now. Old Dyson's humiliation had brought with it the death of his friends and his brother. He had to assume that Mendelin was no more, else where was he? And Sari was, like him, to be a victim of another sort. It might have been difficult if the power he had thought he wielded had been truth. Then old Dyson could have at least tried to make a stand, possibly save his friends from sharing his fate. However, he was no threat to Lucian. He was nothing. Nothing. His gaze passed from the desperate Saranthina to Achilles' cold body and back again. They had fought for him more than once. They had believed in him, just as so many had. One of the Parthens suddenly ran up to help Cyrus's daughter. Roma's face, disfigured far more than ever, took hold of her with burnt hands. Another Parthen joined him, then another. Their added mass slowed, but did not halt her progression. Lucian merely laughed at their antics. But as he laughed, a score more Parthens tried to charge him again. This time they had weapons other than their axes and pitchforks. They used what they would have described as magic. Around the Primus, the air became a cornucopia of violent energies. Rocks appeared out of nowhere. A tree limb went flying at Lucian's handsome face, only to go bouncing back. Among the fighters was Bartha, who had tears in her eyes and a grim set to her mouth. Old Dyson noted with dismay that there was no sign of her son. He prayed that the boy was somewhere farther back, unharmed.
The potential is there,
Lucian commented, nodding at his attackers in approval despite their dismissal results.
but I think I prefer to just the one and train others from scratch.
He said the last with a dark gaze at the Parthans. The jungle floor burst open around the Parthas group. The fiery, molten earth below it engulfed her and several of the others. Their screams filled Old Ison's ears. No! He screamed at the top of his lungs. His eyelids clamped together tightly as tears coursed down his face. He beat his fist against the soil, repeating his anguished call, "No!" It took Old Ison a breath to notice that the rest of the area had fallen into silence again. He worried that the carnage Lucian had earlier wrought had now faded in comparison to what had just happened. Tears continued to streak down his face. The son of Domeets opened his eyes. To his surprise, he beheld Bartha and the others untouched. A wall of formerly molten ground rose around them, yet it had obviously cooled completely, for one of the Parthans began cracking open the side with his foot and fist. Old Ison gave thanks for the miracle, then discovered two more. One was that Seraphina no longer helplessly moved toward Lucian. Instead, Romus and the others with him even now carried her away. The final, and to him in some ways most astonishing, miracles concerned himself. Old Ison no longer floated in the air. Only now did it register him that he had been pounding his fists, that he knelt on the ground, that he, not Lucian, had made it so. Lilith had lied to Old Ison. It should not have surprised him. He could not guess that the reason he had been able to fight her had been because of what he had thought her to be. She had used that to crush his spirit further. Old Ison pushed himself up to one knee. His gaze grew terrible as he looked at his persecutor. The treacheries of Lucian and Lilith combined in his mind to further fuel his determination. No more, the once simple farmer intoned, rising. No more of this. The Primus did not smile now, and there was that in his face that hinted more ever of his true monstrous self.
You do well not to provoke me, mortal. This kind and civilized exterior is a shell, nothing more. You do not want to anger what lurks just beneath.
Shaking his head, Old Ison returned. You have it all wrong, Primus Lucian, brother of Lilith. You should be careful not to provoke me anymore. This caused the demon to howl with laughter, but Old Ison could almost swear that there was something hollow to that laughter. There had been no reason why Lucian would have lessened his control over the human. Old Ison had freed himself, and that meant that the gift, no birthright, Lilith had called it, flowed through him much as he had once believed it. Perhaps not as powerful and as malleable as it seemed, but certainly Lilith had lied when she had said he was nothing without her. Leave now, Old Ison suggested sharply. Leave now or finish it here. Lucian ceased laughing.
Death comes. Nephilim.
Hot ash rose up, covering him. Scalding earth bathed his body. As the ground crumpled, he started to sink beneath it. Old Ison took one stubborn step toward his adversary. When that succeeded, he took another. He paid no mind to the ash, to the fire-hot ground, and because of that, they did not harm him. In the back of his thoughts, Old Ison sensed those who had survived the demon's assaults, gaining their own strength from his renewed confidence. They were more alive and well than he could have hoped. That in turn gave Old Ison the impetus that he needed to take another step, then another. And when he had crossed half the distance, it was to note with amusement of his own Lucian taking an unconscious step back. Will you not give me your blessing after all, Primus? A blessing such as your servant Malik gave the good master Ethon, his son, and others? The amusement vanished, replaced by disgust.
You seem to favor it. I will give you my blessing.
The demon croaked, his voice no longer at all cultured or even for that matter sounding human.
And then I will die on your entrails and drink from your blood from a cup fashioned from your own fragile skull.
And as he spoke, the facade of humanity fell away. Lucion's aspect grew terrible, too terrible to behold, even more so to old Dyson because there was no resemblance to Lilith after all. Lucien stood again half taller than the demoness, and much more broader, but he too had the thorns that acted as a mane all the way down his scaled back. Yet where she had only had one tail, her cursed brother had three, all spiked from top to tip with dagger-like projections longer than old Dyson's hand. Lucien took a step toward him again, and in doing so revealed that he also had the hooved legs his sister had. His hands were different, though, for the fingers on each numbered more than 5, and the claws were like those of a badger, but dripping with what surely had to be poison. And of the face, only the eyes were identical. Lucien, who played at being the handsome, schooled cleric, was a beast whose head more resembled a toad. His mouth was wider than the top of his skull, and row upon row of teeth greeted old Dyson. The brother of Lilith had no nose, not even nostrils, and his chin was hooked so sharply in the middle that old Dyson could only imagine it being used as a weapon.
Well,
The rest of the demon, his grin literally growing from ear to ear, the latter long and wide as if for a creature even larger than he.
Come, old Dyson, old Diamond. I'll give you a blessing definitely.
Yet, although Lucien was daunting, he no longer instilled fear in the man before him. Only loathing touched old Dyson, loathing that any such abomination could be allowed to exist in this world long enough to taint it. Surely it was wrong that such as Lucien walked sanctuary. Yes, that was the name of the world. The lands. Then give it to me, he demanded the demon. Give it to me. Almost immediately, old Dyson felt a churning in his stomach, as if the organ itself sought to escape. That sensation was joined by a similar one in his lungs, then in his heart. He had no doubt that if he let it happen, then all of them would rip free. He wondered if Lucien understood what the spell felt like. Would the demon suffer so? As if his thoughts were action, he saw Lucien suddenly clutch his chest. The demon looked perplexed. Pain was recognizable in his unsettling eyes. He stared at the human. The turbulence in old Dyson's own ceased. Lucien recovered simultaneously. The demon hissed.
Little tricks for little creatures.
So no reason to reply. Old Dyson strode closer yet. He did not know what he intended to do, just that he had to be done, and it had to be done quickly. Curiously, the less distance between them, the less Lucien struck him, even as a threat. Old Dyson felt a surge of strength adding to his own, and knew it to originate from the Parthens and Saranthina. They had not only had continued to believe in him throughout all of this, but more than ever were certain that he was what they had thought him. Understanding and appreciating that, old Dyson lunged for his horrific foe. What he did now, he no longer did for himself in the least. All he cared about were those who followed him. His audacious attack left the demon stunned, but only for a second. As the two collided, Lucien's tails flung forward like that of a scorpion's. They struck old Dyson across the back, especially the spine, again and again, sinking all the way inside. Yet each time they were immediately repelled, and the wounds would heal in scarcely a heartbeat. Old Dyson felt a slight discomfort, nothing more. He managed to seize one tail, and, despite the spikes thrust through his palm, tore it off. The demon let out a howl of both pain and outrage. Old Dyson contemptuously threw aside the appendage, then sought out another. However, Lucian withdrew them, no doubt to use when he was less likely to lose one or both in the process.
How was she my sister?
The master demon murmured as the two of them locked together again.
Was she all you ever dreamed? All you ever lusted for? Lilith is every creature's desire, you know. She had so many lovers beside you, but only one did she love. Oh, but not you.
Old Dyson let Lucian talk. The pain of Lilith's false love still stung deep, but not enough to sway him from what needed to do. He cared only about stopping this horrific foe.
She loved only one. Yes, his name was Ignatius. You recall it.
There it was again. Ever Old Dyson was nothing to such beings, just as all humans were nothing to them. No more, he suddenly thought. We will no longer be nothing to such as this. I will bend to no one. Old Dyson finally retorted. He gripped the demon by the throat. Whatever he hoped to do, he had to do it now. The longer they struggled, the more likely that Lucian would find some weakness to exploit. Least of all, one who is nothing to me. Lilith's words came back in a rush. Only now he saw them as reversed. He was not the nothing she and those like her and her brother were. You are nothing, Lucian, and that is all you deserve to be. The demon started to laugh again, but the laughter turned into a hideous choking. Lucian clutched at the hand holding his throat, but not because Old Dyson squeezed tight. In fact, the human only gripped it enough to keep his monstrous adversary at bay. An overriding desire filled Old Dyson, a desire to see his words become fact. Nothing, Lucian, nothing. Old Dyson blinked. A pale cast swept over the demon. The harsh colors of his body grew faded, as if somehow bleached. Lucian's tail abruptly renewed their frenzied assault, but now they did not even pierce the human skin. In fact, for all their effort, the tails felt like light touches of wind, and gradually not even that. And then Old Dyson noticed that he could see part of the dark jungle through the demon. That encouraged him to press forward. He utterly ignored Lucian's desperately scratching claws, which were no more than less pain pricks now. At last, the demon cried,
Beware! Old Dyson, she is not through with you. My sister never lets go of a toy until it's shoot-righted. But I know her ways. I can help you. I can act as your guide. I will bow to you and call you master. Just listen.
I hear nothing but the calls of the jungle creatures, Old Dyson replied with a shake of his hands, and the whisper of wind, now already dying down. Nothing more. Lucian's mouth moved, but now no sound came from it. Under Old Dyson's fingers, scale gave way to empty air. The demon was now transparent. His face bore a contorted look of fear, for he did not understand what was happening. What Old Dyson was doing was impossible for any human, but not for a Nephilim. And at that last, the demon became, as Old Dyson had said, nothing. The son of Demete stood there, his fingers still bent as if holding a throat. Slowly, Old Dyson straightened them, then studied the palms as if seeking some great truth there. He blatantly sensed a figure cautiously approaching him from behind. Already aware of just who it would be, Old Dyson slowly turned. Even then, Romus let out a squeak and stepped back several paces. Forgive me, Master Old Dyson. I meant no treachery. Coming up on you that way, it was just that... The way you were standing there, It's alright, Romus. It's alright. Is it over? Asked the Parthen. Is the demon dead? No, he just isn't at all. Romus only looked more confused. With a sigh, the son of Demit said, "The demon is gone forever. We're alright." However, even as he said the last, old Dyson knew that it was otherwise. Around him, still illuminated by the blazing cracks in the ground, lay the wreckage of the jungle and, worse, the bodies of too many who had followed him here. Some, he could see, were beyond help, but there were others still clinging to life. Without thinking, he walked past Romus and went to the first of the injured. The man's face was vaguely familiar to old Dyson, but otherwise he knew him as a Parthen. Still, that was enough, and just the thought of what this one soul had suffered was enough to make an already drained old Dyson shed tears again. He reached down to try to better position the injured man. With a soft glow formed under his palms, the Parthen gasped, his chest swelling to full capacity. Old Dyson pulled his hands away, but then he noticed the bruises and cuts on the arm's face again to recede. The shoulder that had been bent as if the arm had been separated seemed to mend. Old Dyson kept his hands where they were until the last of the wounds had faded and the Parthen breathed normally. As he rose, he suddenly noticed that there stood around him other Parthens, all staring in rapt awe. Reaching out to one with a bleeding scar across her face, old Dyson repeated the process. When he took his hand away, she too was healed. And so he went from person to person, from those surrounding him to those lying prone on the ground. Old Dyson tried to find those most in need of his assistance and help them first. How long he took, he only understood when the first light of day filtered through the thick foliage. Exhaustion filled old Dyson, but so did excitement. He had managed to help all those who could be helped. Despite Lilith's claims to the contrary, doing so thrilled him more than ever overcoming Lucian. But that thrill evaporated when he finally confronted Serenthina. She still cradled Achilleos' head in her arms. Old Dyson had almost approached her once during his night's work, but he had felt guilty in knowing that his friend had perished trying to rescue him. Worse, he had known that Achilleos was beyond his powers. There stood another with her, when he had also almost thought dead. Mendeln, as pale as the dead archer, stood soberly over the lovers. He eyed his brother as old Dyson neared, nodding once. "You did it," she lied. She lied. He started to ask Mandolin about his part in the final moments, but Serenthina chose that moment to look up at the older brother. "Old Dyson, is there nothing?" In truth, he had tried once this night to do the unthinkable. Tried once and failed. Old Dyson was not so certain that it had been a bad thing, even if it meant no hope for his friends. "I'm sorry. Nothing." She nodded in understanding, which made his heart ache more for her ordeal. Mandolin looked past his sibling to where the Parthens were building a great fire. As was their way, they were preparing to burn the dead. "They should bury them." His gaze grew intense as he focused on the pair again. "At least we should bury Achilleos. Do you not agree?" Although slightly unsettled by Mandolin's determined expression, old Dyson nodded. That was how it was done in Surum, save when disease demanded otherwise. Still, it was not his decision to make. "The choice is yours, Serenthina." She did not hesitate. He would prefer to be buried, to be a part of the jungle, if not a forest. Manolin smiled grimly. I know, just the place. The brothers carried Achilles themselves, with only Cyrus's daughter following. When Romus and a few others sought to come, old Iceman forbade them. This was a personal matter. He allowed Manolin to lead. After some trekking through the thick underbrush, old Iceman's brother paused at a lush region nearby which could be heard a rushing stream. Tall, thick, and healthy trees surrounded the area. Old Iceman felt a sense of calm pervading the area and immediately approved of it. Serathina too acknowledged Menolin's choice as the correct one. With tools borrowed from the Parthians, the pair dug the grave. Old Iceman considered seeing what he could do with his abilities rather than his hands, then thought how Achilles deserved more effort than that. The ground was soft and surprisingly easy to remove. They soon had a hole deep enough to make certain that no scavengers would dig the body out. After gently depositing the hunter within and filling up the site, Semidemides and Serathina stood in silence. No words were said, for words were inadequate for moments such as this, at least to them. Their souls spoke to the lost one, each bidding him farewell in their own way. It was Serathina who finally broke the spell, the dark-tressed woman suddenly turning to old Dyson and crying in his arms. He held her much the way he had held his little sister in her last days. Mandolin politely turned his face away, at the same time muttering some final message to Achilles. And then it was over.